The 12th parliamentary elections in Bangladesh are concluded. Not without controversy, several media outlets said it was not a free and fair election. Bangladesh's Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina retained her place for fifth term, with the Awami League securing 75%, that is to say about 223 seats out of 298 in the parliament. The State Department, New York Times, Reuters, and others they say there were allegedly irregularities on election day, and the main opposition party, as you may know, BNP, boycotted the election altogether. Now, there were ample independent candidates as well, and 61 of them obtained a seat in the parliament, and the third largest party of the country, Jatinya, got 11 seats. Now, we want to know what went on election day and speak with observers that were there. Joining me today is Terry Easley. He's a certified OSCE observer from the United States, and Volker Friedrich from Germany. Mr. Friedrich is a political analyst and founder and CEO of GBP International. I'm Nicolette de Vidar in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us. So good morning from Washington and good evening to Dhaka, I suppose. Let's dive right in. Since there have been quite a bit of chatter, actually, in terms of what's going on. I want to talk about observations. I want to talk about voter turnout. I want to talk about parties registered, parties participated, but then also about the election process itself. Now, first questions first. When have you both arrived in Bangladesh? Since when have you been there? Mr. Easley.
Well, I got here, I believe, on the, about a week ago. I came first, and I have to leave last. As head of mission, you have to come first and be the last to leave.
Okay, so you had enough time to see what Dhaka looks like normally during the week, and then also on the election day.
There's people everywhere, yes.
Yes. What about you, Mr. Friedrich? When did you arrive?
Well, for me, it's more or less the same. I arrived here the Thursday before the election day. Election day was on the Sunday.
Yeah.
And the interesting part to note, because I was here before in Dhaka, it's, as you know, one of the most densely populated cities in the world. But we found this place to be very quiet. And the reason was that it was a very long weekend. Because Friday, nobody working normally, and then election day as a holiday. So the streets were very quiet, and it was smooth ride with the cars and the traffic, which is very exceptional for a place like Dhaka.
Yeah. Now, the numbers we got were there were 127 observers and 71 journalists. Can you confirm that?
I think it was actually more than that, but yeah, that's pretty much it. I think the total number be nationwide would be closer to 300. Now, we had 30 in our core group from 7 different countries, but it was a lot more than they had last time, I can tell you that.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about the day. Where did you go to observe? Did you go to different places? Did you have a main stakeout? Tell us about the locations. Where did you go?
Well, our team of observers was parted into individual groups of 3 teams, 3 people per team, and they went all throughout Dhaka. And on average, we visited 8 to 10 polling stations during the day, from 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, until the polls were closed. They went to poll stations which were busy, others were more quiet. It varied also, of course, during the daytime, because early morning was quiet, lunchtime was quiet. And then we had stations in the afternoon in the outer parts of Dhaka, where we had a significant larger turnout of voters, which you can notice by the queues of people lining up. So it was a good mix and a good representative selection of polling stations we visited.
Now, did any of those polling stations actually get like a heads up? So in terms of were they notified when election observers were arriving, or was this really totally ad hoc?
We didn't tell them we were coming. Somebody else might have. I mean, you see a truck full of police in front of you, and, with sirens going off, and then maybe, a van with a big sticker that says election observer. So if they didn't tell them we were coming, they would pretty much know we were coming.
Now, just for us to understand, have you observed elections before, either in Bangladesh or other countries, just as a comparison, so we know a little bit more about you both?
Well, I have both as an observer and as a journalist, many years of experience as a journalist, two-time Associated Press Broadcasters Board of Directors, elected by the membership, a national network news anchor in the United States, and I hosted one of the highest rated local morning TV shows in America, and I was managing editor of CBS Radio News in Los Angeles at KFWB All News Radio. But the thing that is really interesting about this election, and the reason a lot of election observers didn't want to come, was because there was pretty much a foregone conclusion as to who was going to win. And that's because one of the major opposition parties and others decided to boycott the election. And because of that, a lot of the election observers said, why go when it's a foregone conclusion? And the answer was because there still may be the possibility of, some problems, some irregularities, some fraud.
Mr. Friedrich, do you have something to add to this one?
I have some experience in Southeast Asian countries. I do my business in places like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and I have also been reporting about the political events there, including the elections. And what we have done here is exactly what Terry described. And it was an interesting experience. No real big surprises. As Terry said, nothing of the unusual happened. We were welcome at each and every polling station. They answered our questions very openly and friendly, and we were well received. So it was a very good exercise, very friendly, very cooperative. There was no indication that anything was like hide it behind our backs or anything like that. And it was also safe with a high level of security. Police, armed forces, wherever you could see. So they took a major effort in making that a safe exercise.
Now, Terry, when you go and observe an election, for example, what is it that you actually look for primarily? What would you say can actually constitute a free, fair election from when you go there and observe? Do you have any preconceived parameters where this is definitely what I'm going to look for?
Yeah, first of all, let me say, we don't care who wins, and we're not afraid of anybody. We're going to call it like we see it. That's just the way it is. But unlike a lot of election observers, I'm also an election fraud investigator. So I know how elections are stolen. I know how they're manipulated. I know how they're rigged. And so I'm looking for this, and I teach my team what to look for. In the case of Bangladesh, they are accused, either rightly or wrongly. We don't know. We weren't there. We can't adjudicate it. But we're aware of the allegations that some vote rigging may have occurred in the past. And that would be in the method and apparatus of ballot stuffing. Ballot stuffing is one of the easiest, oldest ways of throwing an election. Now, one of the things we were on the lookout for was the ballot box. When does the ballot box arrive at the polling station? And what conditions is it in? Well, they arrive the night before, and they are open. They have not yet been closed. And when they are closed, in this case, because we asked every guy that was in charge of the polling station we went to, did you receive these boxes last night? Did you spend the night here at the polling station? They all had a sleeping bag. They spent the night at the polling station. And they said, yes, they arrived open, and they're clear plastic so you can see through them. Make sure there's no ballots already stuffed in them is basically what I'm saying. And then we put the top on, and we put 4 tabs that are all numbered the same, and that number matches the bin itself. And we attach those on there in the presence of the observers for each party. And this is something I thought was really interesting. Everywhere where the voting was taking place, over against the wall, they've got 4 to 7 people sitting there from different parties for different candidates who have registered to be an observer. And they're actually watching the vote happen. They watch the people go behind the curtain and they use their stamp to make their vote. Then they come out and they fold the voting ballot and they put it right there in front of God and everybody, and they view it. So it's very hard to then stuff the ballots later. So you're either going to stuff the ballots before the box gets there, or you're going to have people either periodically or at one time just put a bunch of ballots in there. And that's very, very difficult to do in the way that the Election Commission of Bangladesh has it set up. To their credit, they have really put together, I think, a very good system using these paper ballots. So again, we asked everybody, did you spend the night at the polling station? Yes. So you were in the custody. Those ballot boxes were in your custody the whole time until the ballots got there the next day. And before the ballots got there the next morning, you had already closed it and you had shut it up with these 4 tabs with witnesses, and they've signed off to that. And so we thought that was pretty strong. That's what we were kind of looking for. We're on the lookout for ballot stuffing because that's been the accusation. Although we thought if anybody is dumb enough to do ballot stuffing in an election that you're going to win anyway, you really don't deserve to be elected. But that did not happen, right? And we thought that would not happen, but we were on the lookout for it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Friedrich, do you have a different take on that, or you wanna add something to those observations? Can you confirm them? Can you say you've seen something else? What did you like? What did you not like?
Well, I have seen the biggest fraud in my life. No, just joking. So what Terry says is 100% accurate, and even though he was in a different team than I was, I think all our groups reported more or less in the same way what Terry has just said. So, I mean, in all seriousness and all fairness, credit where credit is due. And there was no striking element of any sign of misdemeanor or misappropriate handling of this election process. And again, we are talking about the process and the the supply chain of the election process. So the ballots were numbered, they were fingerprinted, the candidates, they had individual symbols, which I found very interesting. But all in all, very transparent, very much above board. So I confirm what Terry has said, and that's our key finding.
Mm-hmm. Yet the State Department said yesterday on Monday that Bangladesh didn't have free and fair elections, and they were concerned about reports on irregularities on election day. Can you say anything to that?
Well, I don't think that's fair to say it that the State Department said it that way. Have you actually read the actual statement from the State Department, or are you reading press reports about people who say what the State Department says?
I read quotes.
Right. Well, I would encourage everyone to read the actual State Department, and not only the U.S. State Department, but the British equivalent also issued statements. And it's more balanced than a lot of news media outlets have portrayed it. And the statements of other countries may not be as important as the way the people of Bangladesh see the election. So I think that's a point on a curve. I can't get too deep in the woods because I have to maintain a strict political neutrality and objectivity as an election observer regarding all of this. But, you have to read those statements, the direct statements from the U.S. State Department and from the British to really get a little bit more of a balanced approach to it.
So then I take it that the papers quoted wrongly, though they were actually putting in quotes.
Well, I've been over here in Bangladesh for a week, and I've been misquoted probably 30 times. You know how it works.
Yeah.
I think what is a very striking perception when you read all the press reports from anywhere in the world. I think the very fact that the BNP boycotted to take part in the election is one of the reasons why many people say the election was not fair and free, because there was no opposition. But this is not what we're here for to report. Our job was clearly to see whether the election as it was designed and happened was a proper and transparent process. So when people say because there was no major opposition party taking part, and therefore it was not free and fair, that's a different statement than to say the election was rigged and was full of fraudulent patterns.
Yeah, and I actually was
So,
going to
yeah.
ask you about that, because I was saying, like, does that automatically, so when there's an opposition party and they boycott an election, does that then make it automatically an unfair, unfree election? And you just said
Oh,
there's a very clear differentiation between observation and fact. Yes, Terry.
Yeah. Whether an election is fair and free has nothing to do with participation. I think what you're talking about is it participatory. And that's a question for others to decide. But our mandate, our remit, our job was to observe and report the election as to three areas. Was it free? Was it fair? And was it safe? Now, it was definitely free and fair from our perspective. We have, 30 people going to 12, of these polling places each, but there's 4,300 some odd polling places all over the country. We can't be everywhere at the same time. So what we're giving you is a representative sample of what we experienced here. And in our experience, in the polling stations we went to, most of them inside Dhaka, some of them outside of Dhaka, we experienced a free, fair, and safe election on election day. Now, leading up to Election Day, I'm sad to report that there was a train fire and that 4 innocent people died in that train fire that was allegedly set by some bad actors, and several people were injured. And that's very regrettable. So not only do you have a major opposition party calling for a boycott, but you also have some 14 to 24 polling stations were torched. A political office of the Awami League was burned to the ground. And of course, you had this train fire that was very tragic and unfortunate that occurred. So this made some people want to stay away from the polls also for fear that there may be more violence. However, as the day drove on and it was a very low turnout at the beginning. But as people began to see that, hey, everything looks okay, I think I can vote, they started coming out more and more. We noticed that by about noon, I think we had about, I think it was 20%, 18.7, 20% about noon as far as the voter turnout is concerned, according to an election commission official I spoke with. Then about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that had moved up to 30%. And then by about 5 o'clock, because the polls closed at 4, but if you were in the line at 4 o'clock, you still got to vote up to 5. So we'll say from 3 to 5, they got another 10% to round out the 40% that has been reported by the Bangladesh Election Commission.
Yeah, so the low voter turnout has been mentioned as a concern, actually. And I was going to ask you, did you observe any atmosphere of fear or on the streets or an intimidation or anything that you came across in Dhaka?
No, not at all, really, to be honest. And I think the opposite was the case. All the people we met walking in or waiting in the line at the polling station, I wouldn't say it was festive or super happy or party mood, but it was very relaxed, very calm, very matured. People were smiling, chit-chatting. They all took pictures with us, and they started to chat around. So no, there was no sign of fear at all in the places I visited.
And there were children, there were grandmas that were 90 years old that were being helped to put in their vote, which I thought was very impressive. And you know who the bravest people turned out to be during Election Day in Bangladesh, in my humble opinion, were the women of Bangladesh. They started showing up first. I mean, Volker can tell you that the very first people we saw voting at every center were the women of Bangladesh.
Yeah, and I got the numbers on the voter participation. So there were about 11.96 million that participated, and male and female. So male were about 6.7 and female were about 5.8 million. So it's, fairly it's up there. Now, there has been the mentioning that when the actual voter participation was announced by the election committee, first it was about 28%, and then it was corrected and went up to 40%. Were either of you in the room at the announcement when that announcement took place?
No, I was not. This is the first time hearing that.
Okay. Yeah, because they were saying that it's not possible that in the last hour suddenly it jumped from 28 to 40. But then hearing what you said, what you noticed and observed, that really the voter participation, picked up in the afternoon. That sounds more like in line with that. It could be possible.
Yeah, we were tracking the numbers in real time to take benchmarks so that we'd see if there was a trend and if it was consistent.
Yeah,
and it seemed to be.
So is there anything from your observations when you compared that to other elections that you observed, for example? Is there something where you say they did really better than others, and some things where you say maybe there's room for improvement?
Well, if
Volker,
I
why don't you
may
take
add,
that?
yeah, I'd love to, because today, a day after the election, we had an coincidental business meetings, and of course, there were talk about the election because that's the story of the day, obviously. Mm-hmm. And one gentleman was very proud. He showed me his iPhone, and he showed me an app developed by the election committee, which was very striking because that app has everything. The list of the candidates, the tax revenue record of the candidate, the geographical distribution of the electoral districts. So really an extremely comprehensive election monitoring app available for every voter when you register with your ID and your name. And that was very striking to me. And that shows that Bangladesh is definitely also an ID country, which is still very much under recognized in the world. And that, I think, is something all other democratic countries should look at, to have that as well. And just a little bit ironically, sometimes forget about data protection, but this was very unique for me to see, and first time I ever saw that.
Mm-hmm. Terry, you got something to add?
Well, as far as technically is concerned, everything was put together and run very well, and we found that every poll worker and the guy that runs the polls, they were all very well trained, very enthusiastic even. And they answered all of our questions. They allowed us to look at anything we wanted to look at. Another thing I was looking at, as an election fraud investigator, is you want to look at the fingerprints. Mm. In the case in Bangladesh, after you vote, you either sign or you put your fingerprint. I don't know if that's because you may not know how to write or whatever, but a lot of people put their fingerprint with the same ink that you would use to vote with, because you vote by stamping your candidate. Mm-hmm. And I want to look to see if looks like the same fingerprint. I know how to look at fingerprints, and they were all different. There was not, usually if you're doing some fraud, you're going to have the same fingerprint going through, and they had none of that. And I can also tell you that in an earlier visit that I had with the election commission in Bangladesh, I was looking for any deception that they gave me, and they gave me absolutely no deception, no signs of deception at all. And I was very impressed with their honesty and their transparency when we talked to them earlier. We even asked them a direct question when all the cameras left the room. Has anyone threatened any of you to do something that you don't want to do? And they enthusiastically did not indicate that at all. One of the election commissioners is a former brigadier general in the Bangladesh army, and these election commissioners, impressed me as being, tougher than a $2 steak. These guys, I didn't think they were scared of anybody, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Now, did you observe any of the media outlets there at the polling stations? Did you observe how dispersed were they?
Everybody was there. And that's another key thing about Bangladesh is press freedom. There's something like 30, 40 channels in Bangladesh. And everywhere we went, they had 50 TV cameras. And so we were quite impressed. And, I go over to the side and I grab one of these guys and I say, look, I'm a reporter. I'm a news anchor. Tell me the truth. Do you feel safe and free to report whatever you want to report? And I actually logged in my log 7 different news media outlets that I spoke with. One was an FM radio station. Most of them were TV stations and a couple of newspapers. And they were without even hesitation. Oh yeah, we say whatever we want. We write whatever we want. We do whatever we want. We feel totally free. And I said, well, okay. I was expecting, quite frankly, a different answer, but that's the answer that I got, to be honest with you.
Now, there have been reports, Terry, and it looks like we lost Volker, so it's going to be you and me here for a moment. So there were reports that there were crowds aggregated or congregated, so to speak, for camera purposes to sort of show that there was a higher voter turnout, etc. And then after the camera was there, they were dispersed. Did you see any of that?
Well, we went to one polling station outside of Dhaka. And I had been to that area before. They had some kind of like a zoo and a restaurant and a park back up in there. And I said, I passed by this exact building last time I came here, and they had a huge line, the longest line we had seen at that particular location. But it did not look, and they already had news media there. They had several news media. I can't see how they could possibly stage something with Press Express and other DBS and other channels being there. I don't see how they could have possibly staged that.
Now, final point on there, and that's the legitimacy of the election. Can you say something as to when, as an observer, and I presume I have an idea of what I think you're going to say, but I'm going to ask you anyway, as an observer.
They always ask anyway, even though they know I can't
exactly.
answer.
As an observer, when would you say you would declare an election illegitimate as an observer? Versus a legitimate election?
Well, if I witness fraud, irregularities, or some type of vote rigging, but I have to say this, that fraud, irregularity, and vote rigging has to be big enough to throw the outcome of an election. And unfortunately, when we look at most elections, even the 2020 election in the United States with President Trump, when we look at those elections, we find some irregularities. We find some fraud. We find some vote rigging, but we don't find enough to overturn an election. And that's always the problem. And this is a nation of 170 to 180 million people, okay? 4,300 whatever polling stations. There's going to be some irregularities. There's going to be some problems. There's going to be a bad actor here and there. But the problem always seems to be that, is it big enough to throw the election? So even if I were to witness with my own 2 eyes, vote rigging, ballot stuffing, you name it, that if it's 20 votes or 200 votes, it may not be big enough to throw an election of this scope and size.
Okay, but what do you mean by big enough to throw an election? So one could argue big enough to throw an election when there's an argument that you have already a country that might be going towards a one-party country, so to speak. Then what makes something big enough to throw an election? Or is this not that not actually a concern at all?
Well, if one party wins by 30,000 votes and you only find 3,000 irregular votes, well, then it's not big enough to throw the election, the outcome.
Okay. That's actually a pretty concerning thing, I think, for a lot of people who have no idea how these elections really go. Like, it seems like, so what's voter rigging and what's big enough? Because I think most people who are also our listeners, they kind of think that it should be exactly all counted. But there's a certain part, what I'm hearing is there's always a little bit that's irregular.
Well, I was also concerned about what we call a MIM attack, a man-in-the-middle attack, when you have electronic voting systems. You intercept electronically the signal from the polling station before it gets to the election commission, and you change the vote, man-in-the-middle attack. And the person doing it is called the kingpin. That's a nomenclature. But in this case, they decided not to use, which I think was wise, not to use the electronic voting machines in this case. and because they are subject to exploit. And so I think I can compliment the Election Commission on that choice.
Okay, so we're at the end of the show. Thank you so much for coming on, Mr. Friedrich. I give you the last word since we lost you here in the middle of this. Did you have any comments in terms of when would you consider an election sort of illegitimate versus legitimate? And then what's your final word on that? What's your final observation?
Well, that's a tough question to close our discussion. The final observation for me is really like I did in many other countries, come here and seeing is believing. Don't read all the articles of people who write about a country or a party and they have never been to that country themselves. So being here personally is eye-opening, and talking to the people who are part of the election system here, who are the stakeholders in this game, that really makes a difference. And other than that, on a technical ground, when is an election rigged and when it has to be repeated, for example, that is beyond my capacity to judge, to be honest. So I think Bangladesh is a country which is full of potential. Being here personally is enriching in a broader sense. And with that, I'm grateful to have had the chance to be part of the election team here.
So final word of observation, Terry, of the election there?
Well, as the head of the International Observer team that was invited by the Election Commission and certified by them, I can honestly tell you that from our representative sample, the election in Bangladesh was free, it was fair, and it was safe.
Thanks so much. Volker, any last word?
Not really. I think that's the best closing remark we could get here today.
We leave it at there. Thank you so much for coming on, gentlemen. Okay. Great to have you. And
I would say one thing that occurs to me, that those who say it was not free, fair, and safe, I'm not talking about representative, but free, fair, and safe. Those who say that, even if they're in the U.S. State Department, I would ask them, well, how do you know? Were you there? Yeah. Did you observe it? Well, guess what? Me and Volker, we were there, and we observed it. We went all over the place, and our team went all over the place. We observed it, and we did not have a single report. We told people early on, if you see something, say something. Say it to us. We have our little, name tags on. You'll know who we are. And we did not receive a single complaint the whole time we were here. So I think that's kind of telling.
And that's why we had you on, because I believe somebody always has to have the feet on the ground, and then you can really see it, and then you can make an assessment, not by hearsay. So thank you so much for coming on. Thank you, our viewers and listeners, and have a good night.